Welcome again to Joe Stunner Boxing. I want to talk about Eddie Hearn and Matchroom because they did this, rebranding thing, and a lot of people are sort of making fun of it. And look, I'm not a corporate-minded person. I don't particularly care about that stuff. Their new logo, what did it say? It looked like 11B, but eventually people will accept that's the Matchroom logo, and all this stuff they're doing, this bells and whistles stuff, fine, get on with it. I'm not a businessman. I'm not particularly a business-minded person. I wouldn't even describe myself as a great devotee of capitalism itself. But if you are, maybe it'll work. Eddie Hearn he has a talent for making money. He has a talent for promoting, for putting spin on stuff. That rebranding thing may work. But here's the thing that strikes me about Eddie Hearn. And I was thinking about this when I was just shortly after I did the video regarding the last video I did, which was the Jake Paul one, and how he's helping women's boxing. It seems to me that Eddie Hearn, because he is, even now, he's still a relatively young promoter, not Ben Shalom young, but he's got that balance right between being youthful enough to sort of grab the zeitgeist, but at the same time, he's got enough experience now, having been in the game for whatever it is, 15 years or whatever, to sort of mix the two together, the old and the new, the wisdom with still having a sort of open eye for new ideas. If you go back and look at Eddie Hearn, his boxing career, he's been ahead of the game, undeniably. I have no great love of Eddie Hearn or any promoter. I certainly wouldn't trust Eddie Hearn, but it's undeniable that he does have this, and he has had this very astute, hand on the pulse of what's going on, being able to see the future. So when Matchroom started out, you remember they sort of worked within their limitations, if you like, and they did a lot of the prize fighter stuff. And in actual fact, they were very, very popular, very successful, those prize fighters, but they were kind of building their rep, and giving the fans what they want, and they were, there was no pay-per-views at the time and so on. If you remember, Ben Shalom started with Ultimate Fighter, was it called? Which was basically a rip-off of Prize Fighter. And that was the platform that propelled him towards his Sky deal. But in actual fact, he was ripping off the Prize Fighter idea. Now, the Prize Fighter thing that Eddie Hearn did was not actually new. I mean, it was very much, if you go back in boxing history, you will see very similar tournaments. I mean, there was a heavyweight one, even as recently as the 90s, I think, which was won by that Pensacola heavyweight, whose name I can't remember, one of Roy Jones's mates. But Tony Tubbs was in it, I think. And it was a bit chaotic, but I think someone was promised £1 million for winning it, and they walked away with $100,000 or something. There was a lot of chaos going on. But knockout tournaments are nothing new. But Hearn made them, put them in vogue. And then once he'd moved on, Shalom and Boxer moved in, and they kind of rode off the back of Hearn's success. And then Hearn, if you look at the way that Matchroom gained traction during the Sky years, a lot of that was because Hearn made himself very accessible to the media, not just the media, but to fans. So if you turned up with a camera, we saw the rise of IFL TV, and Hearn he's good friends with Kugan Cassius, and he'd actually pay Kugan's expenses, give him £500 or whatever, to get from A to B, so that Kugan could, do the interviews, including one with Hearn, put them on YouTube, and Matchroom's name, and certainly the bright smiling face of Eddie Hearn became kind of familiar with fans. It's almost like Hearn was, even though he makes fun of himself, the self-love element of himself, he was using himself as a charismatic frontman. And in other words, he understood social media probably before social media became what it is today. So he used that, and other people were taking the piss. I mean, Frank Warren, when Queensbury were in the doldrums at Box Nation, losing money hand over fist, he would make fun of Eddie Hearn. Do you remember there was a big press conference with, I think, Ricky Hatton was there, Frank Maloney was there, possibly Mick Hennessy, I can't remember. There were lots of promoters. They were all saying, oh, if Hearn was a bar of chocolate, he'd eat himself and all this. They were taking the piss. Hearn was the one who had his eye on the future. He understood the power of social media, of the internet, of YouTube, of all that other stuff. Okay. And others, of course, followed suit. So eventually you've got IFL doing interviews. In fact, if you remember the Box Nation days, when James Helder was still involved with IFL, there was a show called Cassius and Helder on Box Nation. And this was after Frank Warren had threatened to sue Cook and Cassius for an interview he did with Barry Hearn, where Barry Hearn had been quite disparaging towards Frank Warren. We know that Frank loves a good old writ. So, but again, Hearn was ahead of the game. And he had his success at Sky. And then what did he do? He said, okay, I've conquered Britain, so I'm gonna go to this strange thing called DAZN, because streaming services are where it's at. Streaming services are the future. And everybody laughed at him again, DAZN, Dead Zone, you had 90-year-old, 93-year-old, whatever he is, Bob Arum taking the piss. Frank Warren said it was, meaningless, didn't mean anything, nothing special. Where's he now, Frank Warren? Where's Queensbury now? They're at DAZN. And Hearn, again, ahead of the game, was the first one there. Now, this can come back and bite you in the arse, as it has with Hearn, because, number one, you don't get enough credit, but then credit it's subjective. Nobody really cares, It's good for the ego, getting praise, but I've always taken the view that if you accept the praise, you've also got to accept the criticism, and I personally wouldn't accept either. If someone gives me a nice compliment, thank you very much, but I don't really take it on board. If someone calls me a rude name, water off a duck's back, don't care. But in real terms, in business terms, Hearn, when he first went to DAZN, it was, going to be the end of pay-per-view. We were going to dominate the world. I'm going to take over world boxing. He swaggered into the United States thinking he was going to take over. It didn't quite work out. Now Matchroom made mistakes. I've made videos about this in the past. And, what about the production values, the team that he hired? There are criticisms to be made. Losing control of the UK market back to Frank Warren, because you should always have your platform, your foundation, your base from where you came from. You should always keep an eye on that. Hearn didn't and lost it back to Frank. And of course, everyone, when it became apparent that DAZN, and streaming was the future, and if you don't believe me, look at the amount of conventional, traditional broadcasters that have pulled out of boxing. It became apparent. Other people started jumping on board. De La Hoya came on board quite early. Like I say, Queensbury are on board. GBM are on board. Streaming is the way to go. But Hearn, being ahead of the game sometimes means you don't reap the biggest rewards. I mean, it's kind of like in music. I'm a big music fan. One of my favourite bands is The Clash. The lead singer, Joe Strummer, was a sort of tongue-in-cheek inspiration for the title of this boxing channel, Joe Stunner Boxing, Joe Strummer. But The Clash, I loved The Clash. And The Clash existed from back end of 76 to, well, in its truest form, the band were together until about 82, 83. They carried on with vital members missing. But the point is, they made this huge glut of music very, very quickly. An enormous amount of very diverse music, rock and roll, reggae, rock, punk, soul, bit of jazz thrown in, very, very diverse set of music. And they inspired a lot of other bands. But while they were in existence, The Clash didn't sell that many records. And then you had people like U2, later on you had Oasis. They came along, they filled out stadiums. But no Clash, this type of music would not have transferred over to what I would consider to be far lesser bands that are not as innovative, not as imaginative as The Clash, but they kind of reap the rewards of, or they sort of reap the produce of the seeds that were sown by The Clash. And now The Clash are considered a legendary band, but at the time they didn't sell many records. The Smiths would be another band. Didn't sell that many records in their existence, but they're hugely influential. That's the disadvantage of being ahead of the game, of being able to see the future. If you're an innovator, very often you will not reap rewards, but what you will do is you will inspire future people to come along. You will make a point and everyone else will go, oh yeah, we took the piss, but God, he was right, or they were right, or, how did this happen? Yeah, we got to get on board with this. And so they will follow suit, and they have less imagination, they have less talent perhaps than the originator. But this is why pioneers are important. It's the old line about standing on the shoulders of giants. You take things further. People make fun of old-time boxers. Oh, I've seen footage of, I don't know, Sam Langford. He's crap. Look at him now. He looks so primitive. Well, of course it's fucking primitive. You're talking about over 100 years ago. But what, you think if Sam Langford with his talent wasn't around today and hadn't had all the advantages, nutrition and what we understand about the body, boxing techniques, training methods and so on, you think he wouldn't have been talented? No, he worked within his time, okay, which is all any of us can do. And if you think that in 30 years' time, 50 years' time, people aren't going to look back at 2025 and say, oh, God, weren't they primitive? They'd never live with today's athletes, or they'd never be as good. I've genuinely heard people say this. They don't realise this. They think that here and now is all that matters because they can't see the future. Very few people can see the future. Very few people are innovators. They have the imagination, the foresight to see the future. And I think if you look at Eddie Hearn, what he's done within boxing, like the women's game is another thing. And I'm a big supporter of what Jake Paul is doing with the women's game. Who was first putting on big women's fights? Eddie Hearn and Matchroom. And other people were saying, Frank Warren included, Bob Arum making disparaging remarks about women's boxing. Now you've got Jake Paul putting on this enormous card. Ben Shalom did the same thing when Clarissa Shields came over and fought Savannah Marshall. So you have to look at the bigger picture, and very few people, the long-term picture, very few people can do that. And I think that this is that ability, that talent that Eddie Hearn has worked against him in that sense. As for the rebrand, fill your boots. I mean, I don't care about it, but to me, it's just a massive PR endeavor to make Matchroom, to freshen it up a bit and make Matchroom it's almost like a blank page. Hey, don't forget about us. We're brilliant, and here's why we're brilliant. And look, we've got a nice new logo and all that. Yeah, that's fine. The bottom line for me is you putting on good fights. I don't give a shit about all the, dancing rah-rah girls and fireworks and all that stuff. It doesn't interest me. But, Matchroom and Eddie Hearn, definitely not dead in the water. I've heard some real doom-laden stuff. Oh, this rebrand smacks of desperation and all that. I don't think it does. I don't think it does at all. I think it's just the standard corporate stuff that they do, which is of no interest to me. I'm a boxing fan, but if it helps boxing, I'm interested. It's like Jake Paul, farcical, sort of Harlem Globetrotters style fake boxing career, but away from the ring, he's doing some fantastic work. So credit where it's due. Doesn't matter whether I like Jake Paul, whether I like Eddie Hearn, whether I like Frank Warren. You have to give credit where it's due. You have to be, in other words, here's that word again, objective. Okay? So my thoughts on Eddie Hearn and Matchroom, leave yours below. Let me know what you think. And thank you for watching. If you like this video, please hit the like button and also subscribe to the channel if you're new, because we want to build the channel up, and it's your channel as much as mine. Much love to all of you. I'll get you later. Bye for now.